the boy who became a ghost in the West. They say Billy the Kid was a cold-blooded outlaw, a teenage killer who laughed while pulling the trigger, a ghost of the Wild West who left behind a trail of bodies and broken lawmen. But what if almost everything you think you know about him is wrong? What if Billy the Kid wasn't born a monster, but was made into one by the brutal world he never escaped? Because buried under the gunfire, the myths, and the legends, there is a very different story. A story of a starving boy, a stolen childhood, and a world so violent that survival itself became a crime. And by the end of this story, you won't just know Billy the Kid. You'll question how many villains in history were really just children trapped in the wrong place at the wrong time. Chapter 1. A Child Born into Chaos. Billy the Kid was born as Henry McCarty in 1859. Not in a town of law and order, but in a collapsing America that was still bleeding from its own identity. His childhood didn't look like childhood at all. There were no schools waiting for him, no stable home, no protection, only survival. After his father died early, his mother moved from place to place trying to survive poverty in a world that offered poor families almost no mercy. And this is where the first brutal truth begins. Truth point 1. Billy the Kid was not raised, he was abandoned by circumstance. His mother eventually got sick with tuberculosis. Back then, that was basically a slow death sentence. And when she could no longer care for him, Henry McCarty was left completely alone in a world that didn't care if a child lived or died. No system.no safety net.no rescue. Just streets. Just hunger. Just survival. Chapter 2. The world teaches him violence. By the time he was a teenager, Henry McCarty had already lived more hardship than most men in their entire lives. He drifted westward like thousands of homeless boys during that era, working odd jobs, sleeping in barns, stealing food when he had no choice. And slowly, something inside him changed. Not because he was evil, but because the world around him had only one language: fire violence. In the American frontier, law was weak, guns were common, and survival often depended on who was willing to act first. Henry didn't become Billy the Kid overnight. He became him one decision at a time. One stolen meal. One runaway night. One fight he couldn't afford to lose. Chapter 3. The First Turning Point. Historians believe his first serious run-in with the law happened as a teenager. He was arrested for stealing food. Not gold. Not money. Food. He was thrown into jail with hardened criminals, men who had killed, robbed, and escaped justice multiple times. Think about that. Starving teenager, locked in a cell with men who treated violence like currency. Truth point 2. The system didn't reform Billy, it trained him. Because jail in the Old West was not rehabilitation. It was survival school for criminals. And Billy learned fast. Very fast. He escaped custody shortly after. And that escape changed everything. From that moment forward, he was no longer Henry McCarty. He was becoming something else. Something the newspapers would later call Billy the Kid. Chapter 4. The name that built a legend. Nobody really knows when the name Billy the Kid fully took hold. But once it did, it spread like wildfire. Newspapers exaggerated everything. Every crime became bigger. Every shootout became more dramatic. Every rumor became fact. And here lies another brutal truth. Fire truth point 3. Billy the Kid's legend was written before his story was even finished. He wasn't just a person anymore. He was becoming a character. A symbol. A warning. And the more his name spread, the less anyone cared about who he actually was. Chapter 5. The Lincoln County War. This is where history gets dangerous. Because Billy the Kid didn't rise alone. He entered one of the most violent conflicts in the Old West. The Lincoln County War. It wasn't just a gang fight. It wasn't just criminals versus lawmen. It was a full-scale economic war between powerful ranching factions. And Billy? He got pulled right into the center of it. Not as a mastermind. Not as a leader. But as a young gunman trying to survive in a world where choosing sides could mean life or death. Truth point 4. Billy the Kid didn't start the war, he was consumed by it. During this conflict, violence escalated rapidly. ambushes, retaliations, burned buildings, dead bodies in the dust, and every side claimed they were justified. But Billy became one of the most feared names in that chaos. Not because he was the most powerful, but because he was unpredictable and willing to shoot when others hesitated. Chapter 6: The Line He Crossed. At some point during the war, Billy crossed a line that changed how history would remember him forever. He killed a man. Some say it was self-defense. Some say it was revenge. Some say it was survival. But the truth of the Old West is this: context rarely survived translation. Only action did. And action made Billy dangerous. Truth point 5. In the West, morality was a luxury most people couldn't afford. Once you were labeled an outlaw, you stayed an outlaw. No trial. No nuance. No second chance. Just reputation. And Billy's reputation was growing darker every month. Chapter 7: The Making of a Ghost. After the Lincoln County War, Billy became a fugitive. But here's what makes his story different from other outlaws. He didn't disappear. He evaded. Sheriffs hunted him across territories. Bounty hunters tracked him. Stories of sightings spread everywhere. But he kept slipping away. Like smoke. Like something almost unreal. The West was too big. Too unorganized. Too corrupt. And that gave him space to run. By now, Billy the Kid is no longer just a boy. He is no longer just a name in newspapers. He is becoming a legend that no one can fully control. But the most important part of his story is still ahead. Because what comes next will blur the line between truth and myth forever. You will discover how many men he actually killed, whether he was truly a cold-blooded outlaw, and why one sheriff became obsessed with ending him at any cost. And most importantly, the truth behind the final days of Billy the Kid. The outlaw years, the myths, and the man behind the trigger. When the West started hunting him. By the time Billy the Kid truly became Billy the Kid, the American frontier had already decided what he was. Not a boy. Not a survivor. Not a victim of circumstance. But an outlaw. A name whispered in saloons. A warning shouted by sheriffs. A story that grew bigger every time it was retold. But here's the uncomfortable truth history rarely explains clearly. Most people who feared him had never actually seen him. They had only heard stories. And those stories were evolving. Chapter 8: How a Myth is Built in Real Time. In the Old West, newspapers didn't just report events. They shaped them. Editors exaggerated violence because violence sold papers. Writers turned small skirmishes into legendary shootouts. And Billy the Kid became perfect material. Famous. Elusive. And already labeled dangerous. So every rumor attached itself to him like dust on boots. Truth point 8. The more Billy escaped capture, the more dangerous he became in the public imagination. Even when he wasn't involved in certain crimes, his name still appeared in reports. Because blaming Billy the Kid made stories easier to sell. And easier to fear. How many men did he really kill? This is one of the most debated questions in Western history. Some legends claim he killed over 20 men. Others say 21. Some even go higher. But historical evidence suggests something very different. Most serious historians estimate, backhand index pointing right around 4 confirmed killings associated with Billy the Kid. Not 20. Not a blood-soaked killing machine. But a young man living in constant conflict, where gunfire was part of survival, not sport. Chapter 10: The Life of a Fugitive. After the Lincoln County War, Billy lived like a shadow. Always moving. Always watching. Always running. He slept in remote cabins. Traveled through deserts. Trusted almost no one. And every knock on a door could mean death. Because by now, law enforcement wasn't just looking to arrest him. They were looking to erase him. Truth point 10. In the eyes of the law, Billy the Kid was no longer a suspect. He was a problem to be eliminated. Bounties were placed on him. Sheriffs built reputations on finding him. And one man in particular became obsessed. Chapter 11. Pat Garrett enters the story. His name was Pat Garrett. a former friend turned sheriff, and the man who would eventually define Billy's final chapter. Garrett knew Billy better than most lawmen. He understood how he thought, how he moved, how he survived, and that made him dangerous. Because this wasn't just a manhunt anymore. It was personal. The greatest threat to Billy the Kid wasn't the law, it was someone who understood him. Garrett wasn't chasing a rumor. He was chasing a pattern. And slowly, the net began to tighten. Chapter 12. The Slow Collapse of Freedom. Billy's world was shrinking. Friends were arrested. Safe houses disappeared. Rewards increased. And trust became impossible. Every alliance carried risk. Every town carried danger. Every face could be a betrayal. And the psychological weight of that kind of life was crushing. Because being hunted doesn't just change where you go. It changes who you are. Living as a fugitive doesn't make you faster, it makes you alone. And loneliness in the Old West was often deadlier than bullets. Pat Garrett finally got what he needed. Information. A location. A moment of vulnerability. Billy was staying in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. A place he thought was safe. A place where he believed he could rest. But safety for Billy was always temporary. Garrett moved quietly. No noise. No warning. No hesitation. The hunt was ending. At this point in history, Billy the Kid is no longer just running. He is being cornered. The world that created him is closing in. And the man who once lived by speed and instinct is about to face the moment that defines every outlaw legend. The final night. The final encounter. And the shot that ended everything, or maybe didn't. Because even today, people still argue about what really happened. Was it justice? Was it betrayal? Or was it something far more complicated? The night Billy the Kid died, and the legend that refused to stay buried. The night history became uncertain. July 14, 1881. Fort Sumner, New Mexico. A quiet room. A dim light. A gun on the wall. And a man the world had spent years trying to erase. Billy the Kid was finally cornered. Or so history says. But this is where the story stops being simple. Because the moment Billy died, or supposedly died, the truth itself starts to fracture. Chapter 15. The Final Moments. The official story goes like this. Pat Garrett entered the room where Billy was staying. Billy didn't recognize him in the dark. He walked in unaware. And Garrett shot him. Quick, final. But even this simple version starts to break apart under scrutiny. Because witnesses disagreed. Details changed. And timelines didn't fully align. The most famous outlaw death in the Old West is also one of the most disputed. Some say Billy was unarmed. Some say he was reaching for his gun. Some say he was ambushed. Others say he was already suspicious of Garrett. But one thing is clear. There was no trial. No last words confirmed by everyone. Only fragments of a moment that shaped a legend forever. Chapter 16. The Legend That Refused to Die. After Billy's death, something strange happened. The story didn't settle. It expanded. Because within years, rumors started spreading. Backhand index pointing right. Billy wasn't really killed. Backhand index pointing right. Garrett staged the death. Backhand index pointing right. The wrong body was buried. Backhand index pointing right. Billy escaped and lived under a new identity. And these weren't just campfire stories. They were serious debates that lasted decades. Billy the Kid became more powerful dead than he ever was alive. Because once a story becomes myth, it stops needing evidence. It only needs believers. Chapter 17. Pat Garrett's Controversy. Even Pat Garrett's role became controversial. Some saw him as the man who brought justice. Others saw him as someone who executed a young fugitive without due process. And worse, some believed he exaggerated his victory to secure fame and reward money. Because in the Old West, reputation was currency. And killing Billy the Kid made a man famous overnight. In the Wild West, justice and ambition often wore the same face. And that makes the truth harder to separate from motive. Why people refused to believe he died. So why did the legend survive so strongly? Because Billy represented something larger than himself. He wasn't just a man. He became a symbol of rebellion against authority. survival against impossible odds. Youth lost in a violent system. And freedom without rules. And symbols are hard to kill. Billy the Kid didn't survive physically, he survived psychologically in American culture. Every generation recreated him. As a villain. As a hero. As a misunderstood boy. As a cold killer. As everything and nothing. The real Billy behind the legend. So who is Billy the Kid really? Not the myth. Not the outlaw poster. Not the newspaper monster. But the human being underneath it all. The poor boy. A homeless teenager. A fugitive shaped by violence he didn't create. A young man trying to survive in a world where survival itself looked like crime. And this is the final uncomfortable truth. Brain, he wasn't an exception to the Wild West. He was a reflection of it. Why his story still matters. Billy the Kid's story survives because it forces us to ask questions we still struggle with today. What creates a criminal? Is violence born or learned? Can a system create the very people it later hunts? And how quickly does truth become myth when it's repeated enough times?